Oh, hello there, dear heart. I thought I heard the latch lift. You've got the quietest footsteps, you know. Come in, sit by the window, won't you? The breeze has just started to carry the scent of thyme, and the kettle's nearly ready. There's a story waiting for us today. One tucked into the corners of a wooden box most folk would have long forgotten, if not for what it held. A stitched sampler, delicate, familiar, and older than it has any right to be. But as you'll see, in Willowmere, not everything old stays asleep. Some things remember, some things return, and sometimes the thread you thought was just decoration turns out to be part of a map. So settle in. This next part begins with a gentle nudge and a thread that's ready to be followed. Summer had begun to press softly into the corners of Willowmere. It didn't announce itself all at once, but crept in slowly, the way warm bread scent seeps through kitchens, or the way a favorite tune hums just below thoughts. The bees moved slower now. The air held the weight of river stones and ripe fruit. Somewhere along the banks of the Wending, the dragonflies had returned, skimming low through the reeds in glints of green and gold. Inside the Lanternkeeper's cottage, the windows were open. The wind carried the scent of thyme, damp stone, and lavender, drying in the rafters. Shadows shifted across the floor in gentle latticework from the swaying garden vines beyond the glass. The Lanternkeeper moved slowly that morning, not from tiredness, but from thought. A quiet kind of thought, the kind that doesn't have shape yet, but still fills the room. They'd slept lightly. Their dreams had been full of thread, of stitched patterns and braids that shimmered when turned to the light. They hadn't remembered the words upon waking, but the feeling had remained, a sense of something nearly known. They swept the hearth, tidied the table, rinsed yesterday's teacup, and folded the satchel they'd carried to Marin's cottage just 2 days before. The lantern they brought back from her doorstep now sat quietly near the windowsill, its glass no longer cold, but listening. They hadn't lit it again since that night. It didn't feel necessary. The light, once coaxed, didn't need permission to linger. Near midday, they turned their attention to the shelf above the hearth, the one with the spare beeswax cloths and the carefully labeled tins of dried balm leaf. A cluster of light bells had begun to bloom in the crook of the window pane beside it, drawing in bees too curious to mind the glass. One buzzed softly against the window, then flew off again content. As the Lanternkeeper reached for a roll of twine, their elbow nudged the edge of a wooden box. It didn't fall, it didn't rattle or shift in any dramatic way, but the nudge was enough to remind them it was there. They exhaled a soft breath, smiling to themselves. They'd known it was there, of course, had seen it nearly every day, sometimes even dusted it. They'd opened it once or twice over the years, most recently in late spring, when looking for an extra lantern seam. But they hadn't thought about what was inside it, not really. Not until now. They brought it down carefully, cradling it with both hands, and placed it on the table beside the folded letters and the notebook, bound in green thread. It was a simple box, no carvings, no lock, just smooth pine, stained warm with age, the hinges a little stiff from time. Inside, a neatly folded cloth, and atop it, an old embroidered sampler. They breathed in slowly. Of course, they remembered this. They remembered exactly as it was. The delicate edge stitching, the slightly uneven tension in the rosemary sprig, the thread that had once been green, now faded to soft silver gray. They had always thought it lovely, but ordinary. A keepsake, perhaps. a bit of practice needlework from a Lanternkeeper past. The kind of thing one tucks away in a cedar box with dried mint and a note in a hand no longer recognized. And yet, today it felt different. Not because it had changed, but because they had changed. They lifted the sampler from the cloth and laid it flat on the table. It was simple in its composition. A circle of lanterns, a braid loosely stitched, a sprig of rosemary at the center in careful script. The light will find its way back by the paths we leave behind. The Lanternkeeper ran their fingers lightly over the thread. It was slightly raised, the texture still soft despite its age. They had never noticed that phrase before. Or perhaps they had once, but without seeing it. Now with the letter still folded beside them, the braid from Marin's cottage tucked gently between the notebook pages, it felt less like a stitched proverb and more like a message, or a memory rising to the surface. In the bottom right corner, barely visible except when turned just so, a sigil was stitched in pale green. The lantern symbol, and beneath it, M-E-R, 3 initials, their breath caught. Marin, Elira, Rowan. They leaned back in their chair. The kettle on the hearth gave a small sigh, as though exhaling with them. They hadn't known the sampler's origin until now, or perhaps no one had. But now, sitting beside the letters, the rosemary, the lantern, the thumbprint, and the dream, it was all beginning to thread together. Later that afternoon, they slipped the sampler carefully into the satchel and walked the familiar path toward the Lanternkeeper's hall. The air was thick with sun. Bees hummed low in the grass. A child laughed somewhere near the market green. The world moved gently. Inside the hall, it was cool and dim. Dust hung like memory in the light shafts that slanted through the tall front windows. They walked to the archive wall, the one where remnants of lantern-keeping past were kept, not in boxes or glass cases, but pinned, hung, laid with care. Bundles of dried rushes tied with forgotten knots, lantern panes etched with initials, diagrams, charms, and samplers. Near the bottom corner, tucked behind a braid of red thread and a tarnished brass wick cutter, hung a weaving pattern they'd nearly forgotten. 7 strands, a twist in the center, a rosemary sprig on the end. They stepped closer. It matched the braid left on Marin's lantern. Exactly. They checked the archive register, book 128, page 47. They turned the pages carefully, and there it was. For safe return, anchored by rosemary and memory, Marin Rowan. The notation was dated nearly 90 years prior, and yet someone had braided it again in the present, without ever having seen the pattern. They left the hall slowly. As they passed the green, a child was singing softly under her breath, a lilting tune half lost to time. Her mother smiled, but then paused, brow furrowing. I never taught her that, she said aloud, to no one in particular. The rush weaver beside her looked up from her ribbons. I've heard that tune before, she murmured, but not in years, not since my gran sang during the mending. The Lanternkeeper didn't speak, just listened. Back in the cottage, the sampler was laid flat beside the notebook. The thread shimmered faintly in the afternoon light, just enough to make one wonder if it had always done so. They picked up their pencil, but they didn't write words, just lines. A lantern, a braid, a circle. A thread stitched loosely between them. A map, not of a place, but of memory. That night they dreamed, not of flame, but of thread. Hands, dozens of them, weaving together through time. Each stitch a memory, each braid a return. And in the lantern circle, Marin stood, quietly, her whisper light drifting just above her shoulder. She spoke only once. The path is sewn. You only have to follow the thread. Well then, isn't it strange how something so small, a sampler in a box, a braid tied just so, can open a door we didn't know we'd been standing beside? I suppose that's how memory works here. Not loud, not sudden. Just stitched into the edges of things, waiting to be seen in the right light. The path isn't always drawn in ink, you know. Sometimes it's woven or hummed or sewn in green thread with rosemary tucked in at the end. And the next part? Well, we'll follow that soon enough. For now, may the hush linger and the light find you gently. I'll put the kettle on for next time.